Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So, Mark, we are taping today's show on Good Friday. And I just want to know what's so good about Good Friday.
Well, Fridays they tend to be good. They're better than Tuesdays. I think we can agree.
Okay, so, I'll agree with that.
It's a theological claim that this Friday is better than the others. And yeah, it's questionable.
Yeah, and yet today is the day that our taxes are due, April 15th. That's not so good.
Yeah. Not a great Friday. I will tell a funny story about Ash Wednesday, which is that I grew up on the West Coast where there are not a lot of really openly practicing Catholics, like most people are Protestant out there.
Right.
And then you and I went to college in Chicago where there are quite a few Catholic people. And this one Wednesday, I was downtown Chicago, I was probably shopping for some things because I was in the Loop. And I noticed a bunch of people with these weird smudges on their foreheads. And it looks like, oh my God, had they escaped from a fire? What the hell is going on here? And I finally found out much later that, oh no, that was an intentional smudge. That's a holy smudge. It's the ash placed on their forehead on Ash Wednesday. Obviously I didn't know a lot about Catholicism at the time.
Yeah, they're just Catholics. Don't do anything to draw attention to them.
Yes. Yeah. Don't make eye contact. Don't make eye contact.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, here's one good thing about this Good Friday. Mark and I are going to mansplain something for you in the next 30 to 45 minutes. And this one is a topic that a lot of people in America have been talking about recently. Daylight saving time or standard time. As I mentioned at the end of our last episode, the U.S. Senate passed a unanimous resolution a few weeks ago, I think, to make daylight saving time permanent. And that touched off the latest round of a long-running debate in our country about the relative merits of daylight saving time versus standard time. So I asked you, Mark, to assess both sides' arguments and tell me which one was better and why. So what did you find?
Well, thanks as always for the question, Joe. I think it's safe to say that everyone has an opinion on daylight saving time, and so it was really interesting to get down deep into this topic. And first, let's kick things off by clearing up what is a common misconception. You have it right, but I have spent my whole life saying daylight savings time in the plural, as many other people do. Officially, however, the term is daylight saving time in the singular. And it refers, for those of you who don't know, to the period that in 48 of the United States begins at 2 a.m. on the second Sunday in March, when the official time springs forward 1 hour, and ends at 2 a.m. on the first Sunday in November, when the clocks fall back. So, Joe, can you name the 2 U.S. states that do not observe daylight saving time?
Yes, I can, but I cheated. Because I specifically wanted to ask you about those 2 states. They are Arizona and Hawaii, and I wonder why they are out of step with the rest of the country, and did you happen to look into that?
I did. I should call out there are a few scattered Amish communities that also do not observe daylight saving time on the grounds that it does not have a biblical basis. But yes, Hawaii and Arizona are the primary areas. And the reason are that Hawaii is close to the equator, so its day doesn't vary much during the year, and daylight saving time would be kind of beside the point. While Arizona opted out on the grounds that its very high summer temperatures would make additional sunlight during waking hours a dubious benefit at best. So they said thank you, but no to the whole daylight saving time idea.
Okay, I worried that was about Kirsten Sinema just being a friggin' pain in the ass, but I guess that wasn't the reason.
No, it predates her.
Okay.
So the time shift is intended to compensate for seasonal shifts in the length of the day, which is a product of the Earth's rotation. Our planet spins on its axis at an angle of 23.4 degrees relative to its path around the sun, and this has the effect of making days shorter in the winter and longer in the summer. The effect is stronger the farther you are from the equator. Famously near the poles, there are some days in the winter when the sun never rises and days in the summer when it never sets. Not every country in the world participates in daylight saving time, but the farther they are from the equator, the more likely they are to participate. 63 countries used daylight saving time in 2021, while 9 others, including the U.S., use daylight saving time in some jurisdictions and not in others. So there are people who will tell you that the idea for daylight saving time came from one of this nation's founding fathers. And Joe, can you name which one?
This one I don't know, but I'm going to say Benjamin Franklin because he was such a genius and the eminent scientist among the founders.
And you would be right. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin was residing in France, where he was acting as the representative of the revolutionary government back home. And he wrote a letter to the Journal de Paris in which he remarked on the fact that the sun was rising at 6 a.m., while most people were getting out of bed quite a bit later. He suggested that the French should rise earlier in order to take better advantage of the early sunshine and burn fewer candles while going about their business after sunset. It is likely, however, that Franklin was simply joking. He never suggested adjusting the clocks. Instead, he suggested things like firing off cannons in the city's streets to wake everybody up. So he probably intended this as a satirical letter in the style of Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal.
Yes.
In any case, France did not take Franklin's suggestion. And up through the 1800s, time was a pretty chaotic situation for anyone who traveled from place to place. Generally, people would set the time by the position of the sun, and so every town and city might have clocks set to slightly different times. Noon in one city might be 12:05 or 11:55 somewhere nearby. That wasn't such a problem if you stayed in one place, but it could be confusing if you were traveling, and it was a true nightmare for railroad companies that by the mid-19th century were trying to come up with regular, dependable schedules for passengers and freight. In 1840, the Great Western Railway in Britain announced that a single standardized time would be observed in all of its stations, and several other railroad companies in the UK and the United States soon followed suit. For the next 15 years or so, you might have to deal with one time inside a train station and a different time in the town surrounding it. But eventually everyone got on the same page, and in 1880, standard time became an official government-mandated reality in the UK.
Okay, so standard time predates daylight saving time. I guess that makes sense since it's called standard, right?
Yes. It was, for the very first time, it was a time that was supposed to be consistent from place to place. Every city, every town would have the same time on its clocks.
Right. Okay, got it.
In the U.S., there were some stubborn holdouts. For instance, Detroit kept its local time all the way up until 1905. But our current system of standardized time, broken into 3 zones, was officially enacted by law in 1918, which I think is kind of interesting. Until I researched for this, I kind of assumed that time just, is.
Yes.
And it didn't really occur to me that at some point it had to be announced, like, okay, now we're all going to set our clocks at the same time.
Right, and also there's so much American history that predates 1918, and as you mentioned with the railroad schedules, it must have been crazy cacophony if you were traveling across the country. Your watch was of no use to you,
Right. Or if you had paid for freight to be shipped to you that was perishable, you would want to know when it arrived so you could go down there and get it. And
yes.
If you didn't know what the time was, relative to that train, then it would definitely be challenging.
That's really interesting. Just trying to imagine what life would have been like for somebody in the United States in the 19th century.
Right.
I really never thought about that.
And that ultimately was the train companies that forced this on us. Like, they were the ones who took the initiative to say, okay, we are just going to get on the same page about what time it is.
Yes. And also now I'm thinking it was the robber barons who ran the trains who decided this for us 150 years ago. And now it's the robber barons who run the golf resorts who are going to decide this for us this time. Some things never change.
They are our eternal lords of time, I guess.
Yeah.
So standard time took care of one timekeeping difficulty, but what about the seasonal divergence of the local time from the rising and setting of the sun? Our next major candidate for the father of daylight saving time is a man from New Zealand named George Hudson. He was an entomologist, and in 1895 he formally suggested shifting the clocks back by 2 hours so that he could spend more time looking for bugs after work. As popular as his idea might have been among his fellow entomologists, it didn't catch on. But in the early 1900s, a British activist named William Willett proposed a similar idea in Parliament with the goal of making better use of daylight hours. Still, daylight saving time did not become a reality until World War I. In 1916, Germany was the first country to institute it as a means of conserving resources, especially coal, that were scarce during wartime. And the U.S. was right behind Germany. American clocks sprang forward for the very first time in 1918, the same year that Standard Time was instituted. After the war, it was repealed nationwide in 1919, and then made a comeback during World War II. In the times between the wars and after World War II, there was a confusing state in which some communities observed daylight saving time and others did not. There was one famous 35-mile stretch of road from Steubenville, Ohio to Moundsville, West Virginia, in which you would have to adjust your watch 7 times to keep it aligned with the local time. It wasn't until 1966 that the Uniform Time Act made daylight saving time consistent nationwide. States had the option of sticking with standard time year-round. As we've seen, Hawaii and Arizona took that option, along with Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But individual cities had to go along with the rest of their state. So you couldn't have a holdout city that had a different time from the city that was down the road.
Right, and that's another thing I wanted to ask you about, that it appears the federal laws are not binding on the states, since Hawaii and Arizona are still not observing daylight saving time. But that would be true even today, with the Senate resolution that just passed. If this were to become the law of the land, permanent daylight saving time, that would also not be binding on the states, right?
Right. Yeah. States would have the option of opting out. Hawaii and Arizona would have the option of continuing on as they were, and additional states would have the option of doing their own thing. So basically what the federal law does is it mandates that states be consistent internally.
Okay.
So you can't have, here in Seattle, we can't have Seattle on one time and Bellevue on a different time.
Right.
If it's in the state of Washington, every city, every locality within Washington is on the same clock.
Right, but vis-a-vis the states, it's more of a recommendation than a law.
Right. And most states will probably want to be consistent with other states just because it's hard. It puts a burden on their citizens to figure out if neighboring states are on a different schedule. But they would have that option if they wanted to go if they were Texas, wanting to be on Texas time.
Right. Okay.
So I don't know if anyone celebrated the daylight saving time centenary in 2016, but countries throughout the world now have more than 100 years of experience with adjusting our clocks twice a year, and after all that time, most people dislike it. In a recent poll of 4.6 million people in Europe, 80% were in favor of stopping the practice. And as you mentioned in your question, a recent bill to make daylight saving time permanent passed the Senate with unanimous consent. At a time in our history when Democrats and Republicans agree on almost nothing, we apparently can all get together on the idea that springing forward every March kind of sucks.
Right.
And there is one indisputably good reason to stop moving our clocks forward and back: the loss of sleep. Bad things happen when our sleep schedules get disrupted. Traffic fatalities go up in the days immediately after the clocks move forward, because everyone got 1 hour less sleep, and it takes a few days for our bodies to adjust. The incidence of heart attacks goes up in the same period, and some studies suggest that our immune systems are temporarily compromised. In 2017, the American Economic Journal estimated that 30 people die every year as a direct result of the transition into daylight saving time, at a social cost of $275 million annually. Meanwhile, there is no clear evidence that shifting our clocks forward and back actually saves energy, which is often cited as the primary reason to keep the system in place. If we use less power to light our houses in the evening, we might also be turning on more lights in the morning or burning more energy on heating and cooling throughout the day.
Well, that's interesting that the energy saving is negligible.
Actually, the data is inconclusive. Some studies indicate that daylight saving time saves energy, while others suggest the reverse. On balance, it seems likely that daylight saving time does save energy in countries that are further from the equator, in England and Canada, for instance. But it causes energy to be wasted in countries near the equator like Mexico, while the U.S. with its northern and southern states might not see much of an overall effect at all. So let's say we agree that we should move away from the twice-yearly time shift, but we're still presented with a choice, which you put into your original question. Should we make daylight saving time permanent, or should we go with standard time? The current bill in Congress is opting for daylight saving time, and considering that the bill's sponsors are Mark Rubio and a bunch of conservative Republicans, you can guess who daylight saving time is popular with. The business community. Your local Chamber of Commerce loves daylight saving time. Under daylight saving time, sunrise at the winter solstice in New York City is at 7:10 a.m. rather than 8:10 a.m., and an hour of sunlight is shifted to the evening. There are some people, including some seated U.S. senators, who seem to believe that daylight saving time somehow magically creates an extra hour of sunlight, but of course that's impossible. It simply rearranges the daylight hours, stealing an hour from the morning and giving it to the evening. So why do some people think this is a good idea? When there's more daylight in the evening hours, people get out of the house. They watch less television and do other things instead. They go out for a drive and stop in at a 7-Eleven. They eat out at a restaurant, play a round of golf, go to the mall, attend a baseball game, or maybe play in a recreational league. In short, they're more likely to be out doing things and spending money instead of vegging out at home. Shoppers in Los Angeles, which observes daylight saving time, spend about 3.5% more in the fall months than shoppers in Phoenix, which does not observe daylight saving time. The golf industry estimates that every month of daylight saving time brings in $400 million, since more people are able to play in the evening after work. The barbecue industry, meanwhile, sets a value of $150 million for every month of daylight saving time. If you think that giving a boost to the local economy is generally a good thing, you are probably on the side of making daylight saving time permanent. Proponents of daylight saving time also argue that getting out of the house in the evening promotes physical and emotional health and reduces the incidence of robbery and sexual assault, since most street crime is documented to occur during the hours of 5 and 8 p.m., and those crimes are less likely to happen if it's not dark yet. Daylight saving time also might reduce traffic fatalities. A 1995 study by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety estimated that making daylight saving time permanent would cut overall fatalities on the road by 1.2% and would reduce crashes fatal to pedestrians by 5%.
That's significant.
Yeah, the rallying cry of this school of thought is, quote, darkness kills, sunshine saves, unquote, on the grounds that darkness during the evening rush hour is particularly dangerous since drivers are tired after a day of work and are more likely to have alcohol in their systems. There are others, though. We'll call them Team Standard Time. They argue that less sunlight in the morning makes it harder to wake up, and more sunlight in the evening makes it harder to fall asleep. And we've already talked about the bad things that happen when people lose sleep. Some studies suggest that sending people off to school or work when their bodies still want to be in bed is associated with higher rates of obesity, depression, cardiovascular disease, and even some forms of cancer, and that these effects are highest among teenagers. This side of the argument argues that standard time, while imperfect, is still closer to our body's natural circadian rhythms, and that it's more important for us to get our sleep than go shopping. And they also have public opinion on their side. According to one poll, 72% of Americans are in favor of eliminating the time change, and by a significant margin, we prefer switching to permanent standard time rather than daylight saving time. But this is America, where money talks. And so the bill that is now in the House with a good chance of going to President Biden for his signature is the more business-friendly option. If signed into law, daylight saving time would become permanent on November 20th, 2023, the additional year intended to give airlines and other businesses plenty of time to adjust their schedules. The states and regions that already opt out of daylight saving time would be exempt from the change. If the bill is signed into law, though, it might not stick. This is not the first time that we've thought about making daylight saving time permanent. We already did that once, back in December of 1973, when Congress implemented permanent daylight saving time to save energy in the middle of an energy crisis. But when clocks did not fall back in November of that year, people had a hard time with how dark the mornings were. To give you some idea, under permanent daylight saving time, sunrise on the darkest day of the year in my home city of Seattle wouldn't be until nearly 9 a.m.
I didn't know about this.
Yeah, on top of that, during the winter of 1974, there were some sensational news stories about children who set out to school in the dark and ended up getting hit by cars as they crossed the street. And there's no story as powerful as a story about a child who loses their life. So public opinion swung against permanent daylight saving time, and the time change was restored the following year. So all this might come to nothing in the long run, but you did ask me to make a choice between daylight saving time and standard time. And the truth is, I can see solid points on both sides of the argument. On the one hand, I do think it's a good idea when people get out of the house instead of staying home and watching television. On the other hand, I'm automatically suspicious of any idea that has the strong backing of the golf industry. And I'm also very much on the side of getting more and better sleep at night, which is easier under standard time than daylight saving time. So I don't have a strong preference, but on the whole, I'd say I'm on the side of daylight saving time because I can lower the shades in my bedroom or put up blackout curtains, but I can't force the sun to set more slowly, which makes this a historic occasion. It might be the one time in my life when Marco Rubio and I are on the same side of an argument. What about you?
You know, I'm not sure. You've presented good arguments on both sides. And I'm thinking, screw the parameters of my original question. Maybe we need to stick with the status quo because we get a little bit of both that way, you know? I mean, I have to admit, I personally like it when the sun goes down later in the day. For example, I play on a company softball team. We play our games on weeknights.
Right.
There aren't many public parks in New York that have stadium lighting for night games. So if we had permanent standard time all year round, the sun would go down too early for us to play ball. And that would, significantly adversely affect my life. But on the other hand, a bill championed by Marco Rubio gets my instant suspicion, just like you. I think he's wrong about practically everything, and it's frankly hard to believe he could be right about this. So I'm immediately suspicious of a bill that is sponsored by him. And then hearing what you said about the business community, it seems like we're choosing business over health. And that doesn't make sense and maybe is an argument for standard time. But given that there's good arguments on both sides, I'm kind of persuading myself that we should continue the onerous chore of springing forward and falling back for the sake of achieving both goals.
This is a scenario where there are pluses and minuses no matter where you are. Like the current situation has the plus of keeping mornings bright for children on the way to school, but as the minus of is sleep deprivation and, the estimate that 30-some people die every year because of daylight saving time, and that there are all these health effects that we don't notice maybe just because we're used to them. And then both standard time and daylight saving time have their own pluses and minuses. So I feel like there are things to be satisfied with and dissatisfied with in every configuration. Because if you think about it, the only thing that we're really biologically tuned into is changing our schedule as the sun changes, like getting up later when the sun rises later, going to bed earlier when the sun sets earlier. And that would imply just a regular throughout the year shifting of time in a way that society is not prepared to embrace. That would be the thing that we would want to do if we wanted to maximize our circadian rhythms. We are clearly not going to do that. And so all of the other choices are not as good, and it's kind of pick your poison.
Yeah, but the changing of the time to twice a year is kind of a nudge in the direction of the summer or the winter, the light or the absence of light. Like I'm thinking when people ask me about weather in various parts of the country and what do I prefer, heat or cold. And my answer is always, I like the change of seasons. So I'm happy to live in the Northeast U.S. where there is a change of seasons. But I think that that's relevant to this conversation in the sense that when we fall back in the fall, we're kind of setting it up. We're saying, okay, we're acknowledging it's going to be dark in the winter. The sun's going to go down early, but that's winter. That's the change of season. Get used to it. Live with it. And similarly, when we spring forward in the spring, that's to announce the light. We love the light. We like to be up. We like to do things after work, after the business day. So let there be light during those hours. So it kind of fits the overall sentiment of having a change of seasons to have the clocks going forward and backward, it seems to me.
I'm not going to say you're wrong, because this is a topic where everything is painted in a shade of gray. So, and I have to admit that maybe my perspective on, let's just choose one of the two and go with it is because I want to get out of the business of trying to change the time on my toaster oven, which is
right.
like a very difficult thing to do. I would like to just get that time locked in and never have to remember how to do it again. But ultimately, I don't think society hinges on that.
Yeah, I hate walking around my apartment twice a year to change the time of the clock on the friggin' microwave and all my watches. And yeah, that's a pain in the butt. And I did ask you to pick one, so I appreciate you are picking one. But your answer, your explication makes me think I'm kind of happy that we're doing both right now.
Right. And even if the bill is passed into law, it could be that we'll go right back to it 1 year later, like we did in 1973. So you can keep your fingers crossed no matter the outcome.
Yeah, I'm all tempted to ask my mother about that because I was alive in 1973, but I don't remember that at all. And that seems a really interesting little anecdote of living history, that we could ask our parents to tell us what that was like if they remember.
Yeah, I remember this was during the OPEC oil embargo. And I do remember that energy crisis. I remember my father siphoning gas from one of our cars to put it into another car. But I do not remember the time change.
Yeah, I remember gas lines, but not this. All right, so thank you. And you must have a question for me for next time.
I do. So I know that you are a huge baseball fan, Joe.
I sure am.
And there are a lot of other people for whom watching their favorite sport is a big part of their life, be it Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, or soccer in other parts of the world. Sports are not only big business, they're very important and meaningful to millions of people throughout the world. So my question to you, Joe, is why? What is it, emotionally, psychologically, socially, or otherwise, that we get out of watching sports? And at the end of the day, is our passion for spectator sports a net positive or negative for us collectively and individually?
Great question. And I'm going to very much look forward to thinking more about this. This is a topic I have discussed with my wife, who just can't understand what it is that makes me so allegiant to sports teams and so enraptured by organized sport. So this will probably provoke many conversations with her as I'm refining my ideas. But yeah, great question. I look forward to this one.
Okay, I look forward to hearing what you come back with in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, I'm going to try something new on our audience this time, reverse psychology.
Okay.
And let's see if they fall for it, okay? If you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining or would like to comment on it or any other episode of this podcast, don't go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. Don't like us. Don't check our sources. Don't leave a comment or question about what you heard.
Please, we have no time for that.
Yes, and most of all, don't suggest topics for future episodes. We don't appreciate your feedback.
No.
We don't want to hear from you, especially if you like this podcast.
Yeah.
Don't give us a rating. Don't write a review. So let's see if that works, Mark.
It can't possibly work worse than my previous did.
Than the status quo, yes. Exactly. But that's it for now, everybody. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.